4,400 years ago, in the middle of the 5th dynasty of ancient Egypt at Saqqara, a tomb was built for what would become one of the most famous same-sex couples in ancient history. Or were they? The discovery of this tomb sparked mayhem, excitement, and controversy in the archaeological community. Were these two men indeed lovers? Or were they just brothers, or father and son? Let's look at the evidence. On the 12th of November 1964, Munir Basta, the chief inspector of Lower Egypt and the chief workman at the necropolis of Saqqara, descended into the darkness of a newly cleared burial shaft. Crawling on their hands and knees, guided only by the light of a kerosene lamp, they entered a small 5th dynasty offering chamber. Through the dim light, they discovered that the walls were inscribed, but there was also something that neither of these characters have ever seen before. Standing tall in the space between two false doors were two men, embracing one another. Now, just to be clear, this pose of two people holding hands with their noses touching is the most intimate depiction that was allowed or occurred in Egyptian art. This ain't no bro hug, okay? This shook the archaeological world. The discovery of a tomb is always a big deal, but one with engravings and iconography never before seen could rewrite a lot of what we know about ancient Egypt. The tomb belonged to two men called Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep, and they were manicurist of the king and the inspector of manicurists of the palace, respectively. This meant they were in charge of the grooming of the king, who was Pharaoh Ini at the time. Grooming the king was a very respectful occupation, so these guys, they were big deals. And this scene of the two of them embracing is repeated on two other walls in this tomb. Something like this was absolutely unheard of in Egyptology. The first question to pop up regarding this tomb was, of course, what was the relationship between these two people? Were they brothers, father and son, just really close friends who couldn't bear to be apart in the afterlife? Remember, it's extremely rare for an elite tomb like this to be shared by two men of equal status, and this sort of mortuary temple was usually reserved for a prominent man, his wife, and his children. So, of course, artwork like this is going to undergo decades of speculation and reinterpretation. This, my friends, is where nuance and independent thinking without succumbing to your own bias comes in. So let's all use our heads and go on this journey together, shall we? At first, it was suggested that Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep were brothers or even possibly twins, and the earliest known depictions of twins at that. The biggest supporter of this theory is John Baines from Oxford University. He described the, quote, exaggerated affection was an artistic choice by the ancient Egyptians to express their reconciliation as a single social person because they were, quote, special liminal beings. Baines's main comparison for his argument was an 18th dynasty stela depicting two people with the title Sen or SN, which he translates to brothers. Their names were Stai and Hor, but the language on a stele now held in the British Museum states their brotherly status in a little bit of an unusual way. It says, "He came forth with me from the womb on the same day." To me, that kind of sounds very similar to brother from another mother or anything bromancy that's said in the Fast and the Furious films. And indeed, the acceptance of Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep's twinship has been called into question, especially as the term for brother in ancient Egypt, which is that SN, has been proven to have some metaphorical uses and can be translated as many other things, such as friend, lover, husband, and colleague. Those are all very formal, so may I suggest some other slang such as work husband, or honestly, even just the regular use of the word brother to refer to someone who is unrelated but shares a connection with you, or maybe someone you consider to be your equal. People refer to each other as brother all the time, and they have done this all throughout history. We've got so much written evidence for it. The term brother in general seems to be more of a complimentary term in a lot of scenarios rather than just describing blood ties. Also, not to mention like how often we use the word twinning nowadays, or just twins in the metaphorical sense. Because we don't know ancient people personally and have no way of getting at their nuance or ways of speaking, we tend to take translations very seriously, and sometimes too literally, in my opinion. Nothing is ever black and white, and we have to live in the gray areas. Yes, they're messy, but that's where the magic happens. Whether or not they are twins, we still need to address the elephant in the room, and that is their very intimate poses and gestures. While both Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep share similar titles, received equal offerings in the tomb, and are depicted the same number of times, there are some core subtle differences in their representation. Some of them are very intimate nuances that were pointed out by French archaeologist Nadine Cherpion. And this right here is why we need more diversity and representation in the archaeological field. Different people with different backgrounds bring new ideas and perspectives. We need these kinds of shakeups because history wasn't just experienced by one kind of person. Cherpion studied intimate portraits of heterosexual husbands and wives from tombs in the 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties of Egypt to determine the iconographic trends and rules that were followed to portray a conjugal relationship. Meaning, she looked at how ancient Egyptians depicted sexual and intimate relationships in the Old Kingdom. When you look at these depictions and put it next to that of Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep, you'd be hard-pressed to say that it was just two brothers. In Old Kingdom art, the embraces we see of heterosexual couples in tombs are meant to portray a sexual relationship, and possibly a continuation of that connection after death. Independent scholar Greg Reeder has therefore suggested that these two manicurists were indeed lovers, and this interpretation has gained a lot of popular support in the queer community. This could indeed be a depiction of a gay couple, and we're all too aware of a lot of queer erasure in history. I mean, there were so many gay couples in history that all these older historians described as, close friends or roommates, especially for women. Look at the story of Michelangelo. He wrote very erotic poetry for his lover, Tommaso de Cavalieri, not to mention how much he drew him. We need to keep that space open for nuance. If it were a man and a woman depicted in this way, there would be absolutely no question in our minds what the nature of their relationship would have been. Don't forget to use that noggin of yours here. Looking at Khnumhotep and Niankhkhnum as a couple, although controversial in some circles, is an idea that shouldn't be ignored, especially since there's no mention whatsoever in the tomb of their biological relationship. And from what I've read, there wasn't even that pesky word for brother. Though I may be wrong, I didn't read every single translation of the text, so I'm just going off the words of other scholars. Now, Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep both had wives and children, which makes sense, as even if they were lovers, the notion of continuing their bloodline and to live on after them, to, maintain their cult and give them offerings after they died in accordance with Egyptian society would be very important. These wives and children are depicted in their joint tomb chapel, but they're never embracing their spouses. The intimacy is exclusively between these two men. You can see their wives on their respective sides of the doors, smelling a lotus flower, while Niankhkhnum is hunting and Khnumhotep is fishing. If we look at Khnumhotep, he's often depicted in a position that is usually taken by a woman or female in scenes depicting heterosexual couples. For example, he is stationed behind Niankhkhnum, who is leading him by the hand, and he's also depicted smelling a lotus flower like the wives are. A man smelling a lotus flower is a very rare occurrence in the Old Kingdom iconography, though it does get more common in later dynasties like the 18th dynasty. I guess you could say Khnumhotep walked so the 18th dynasty could run. There's also this really interesting banquet scene in the tomb with the two men on either side of the table. Now, what remains in this banquet scene isn't really the important thing that I wanted to talk about. It's what was purposefully erased shortly after its engraving on the wall. Sitting just behind Niankhkhnum at this banquet table was his wife Khentikas, where she originally was presented as just very slightly smaller than him. If it had stayed intact, it would have been the only instance in the tomb chapel where a wife was depicted as almost the same size of her husband, and also embracing him. Before you get all up in arms about the size, it was normally quite common to have wives depicted quite smaller as they are in the rest of the tomb, so don't read too much into that. What is important to note is that a decision was made to remove Khentikas from the scene, leaving only faint outlines of her fingers. One hand can be seen holding onto Niankhkhnum's shoulder and the other holding his arm. That means, for some reason or another, it was decided to plaster over Khentikaus and only have Khnumhotep and Niankhkhnum as the guests of this banquet. Interestingly, there was no space allotted for Khnumhotep's wife, as he had his back against the wall and is holding that lotus that I mentioned earlier. This is the scene where he was smelling the lotus flower at the dinner table. How cute! Like, got him flowers. I love it. Underneath this scene of Khnumhotep holding the lotus is a music scene where the conductor facing the musicians says to play the one about the two divine brothers. According to Reader, this phrase in ancient Egyptian is usually referring to Horus and Seth, meaning this song could have been sung to men at a banquet and have been filled with very coded erotic messaging. Ooh, how forbidden, love of them, and he got him a flower. I love it. Someone needs to start making some fanfic filled with all that sexual tension between these two at dinner, with Niankhkhnum's wife like right there. I can just, the drama, I can see it unfolding right now. The illusion of Horus and Seth that's made is probably referring to an instance that we have record of in the Chester Beatty Papyrus 1. In this papyrus, we have quite the graphic story of how the god Seth tried to sexually dominate Horus after a banquet. Egyptologist Richard B. Parkinson has suggested that the seduction of Horus by Seth was not motivated by power, but of lust. In fact, he's even claimed something Seth says as the earliest recorded pickup line, which is, "How lovely your backside is." Girl, that's like the equivalent of, "Hey girl, is your dad a baker? 'Cause you got nice buns." The sass in Egypt, I love it. This is why we need that nuance. We need to look at things with less of a serious light all the time. And just remember that these people were humans too. There's always going to be a lot of interpretations of stories, especially when they're being deciphered from ancient languages. But maybe this encounter between Horus and Seth was indeed consensual and it was just a lot of hot, angry sex? No one knows, but what we can hypothesize is that ancient stories naturally have more of an oral tradition, and therefore it's possible the song that was sung at the banquet of Khnumhotep and Niankhkhnum was that of Horus and Seth getting it on. Rebuttals for this theory of them being a same-sex couple state that this intimate pose could signify a socially and emotionally linked role professionally, and that this idea of them being a gay couple is due to people imposing modern ideals and preoccupations on the ancient world without looking at cultural context. Essentially, people who are against this idea are saying that people from certain communities are looking for examples that they can adopt and twist into fitting with what they're looking for, which here would be an openly queer representation in the ancient world. Homosexuality wasn't referred to very often in Egyptian documents. All we have to really go off of is a general sentiment from the references that we do have in myths, and it's not always viewed in the best light. The ancient Egyptians may not have been anti-gay, but they were possibly not as open or accepting of it as in other ancient cultures like classical Greece. And before you get mad at the scholars for just saying that people are looking for things to suit their ideals, you have to remember that this sort of questioning and criticism is important because we need to do as much impartial research and discussion as possible, or else history repeats itself and we get tyrants and very bad people twisting history to fit their narrative and cause harm. That, or we get ancient aliens or the number 23. Of course, looking for queer representation in history and highlighting the previously lost voices of minorities is something that is on the good end of that spectrum, but I'm just trying to remind you guys that in this time of quick judgment and decisions that, maybe having a devil's advocate isn't the worst thing, and it can help ground you and make sure your hypothesis is backed up properly. We want to be good scientists. We want to be good academics. You know what I mean? The theories of Khnumhotep and Niankhkhnum being either twins or lovers have been the main two interpretations for the past few decades, but recently, David O'Connor, a professor of ancient Egyptian art at NYU, has suggested that they weren't just your regular run-of-the-mill twins, but in fact, conjoined twins. To him, this is why there were so many depictions of them holding hands and embracing in their tomb chapel. If Dr. O'Connor is right, then this would be an amazingly rare example of documented conjoined twins and provide insight into how disability was viewed in ancient Egypt. Other evidence we have of this does show that ancient Egyptians seemed to celebrate people who were different and viewed them as auspicious instead of in a negative light. Different attributes were seen more as a positive than a negative, and it attested to the creator god's ability to create things in whichever form he pleased. We know from history that conjoined twins can go on to lead pretty normal lives, partaking in labor like fishing and hunting, just as Khnumhotep and Niankhkhnum are depicted in their tomb chapel, and even marrying and having children. It also would have made sense for them to have the same job, and hey, having two people manicure your hands simultaneously would have been pretty luxe, and I'm sure the king would have appreciated it. O'Connor also refers to their names for more clues. He said that both Khnumhotep and Niankhkhnum refer to the god Khnum, who creates children in the womb. He does a lot of other things too, but this is, one of his main jobs. But this could add to the further significance of them being physically paired instead of sexually paired. Other Egyptologists have also pointed out that the name Khnum is similar to the ancient Egyptian word kenem, which means to unite or be united. Even though none of the art on the walls depicts them as being physically conjoined, they're just close enough to have their belt knots touching, actually. O'Connor says that mortuary art in ancient Egypt was more of an idealized type than actual depictions of people. Which is true, as everyone in Egyptian art looks 16 and thin and perfect. Definitely not realistic to how everyone looked back then. Egyptian art is more symbolic than anything else, so depicting a physical join between Khnumhotep and Niankhkhnum could have manifested in this way. O'Connor himself has said that this theory doesn't have, let's say, conclusive evidence, but hey, it's still something pretty cool to think about, right? So which interpretation do you think holds the most water? Clearly the way I've ranted about it shows a little bit of my own bias. I mean, I wouldn't look at my twin that way if it were me, but stranger things have been known to happen. The fact that we only have one of these depictions in the entire history of ancient Egypt is something we shouldn't take as lack of evidence either. It seems that the 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties of ancient Egypt saw a lot of experimentation in how affection was represented between couples in official monuments. So maybe this time of artistic freedom before canonization created a unique window unavailable to anyone else with the means to do so, to, allow these manicurists the opportunity to construct their own monument to their love and bring both of their families together so that they could live together for all eternity. And if that is true, then we'll have to start rethinking our view of ancient Egyptian society. Perhaps it was way more open and welcoming than we originally thought. I'll link some sources in the description for you so you can have a read of all the evidence and let me know what you think in the comments. Remember, there are going to be flaws in every theory. That's where evidence and critical thinking come in before you rush to a conclusion to suit your idea of the world. Just use that noggin of yours. Thanks so much for watching, you guys. If you liked that video, go ahead and smash that like button down below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you never miss out on a video. And if you like the videos, you want to help support the channel, head on over to Patreon and become a patron. You get early access to all the videos. You might get your name on the screen right here like these lovely people, and some other really cool stuff as well. The link is in the description. Stay dirty, my friends.